Good afternoon. In our continuing conversations about South Carolina history, I thought I would take a step back from politics and the Constitution and all of that and talk about one of my heroes, one of South Carolina's heroes, and I would argue one of America's greatest heroes, and that is Francis Marion. And part of that is because over the last 20 years, ever since the filming, the film produced by Mel Gibson, The Patriot, Francis Marion has been getting a bad rap in the press and particularly being left out of some history books. In fact, after The Patriot was released, and it caused a sensation on both sides of the Atlantic, Francis Marion was a hero. The UK, a critic said, "The real-life Gibson's character is based on someone known for shooting civilians and raping his slaves." The London Daily Express said Marion had a reputation as a racist and hunted Indians for a sport. And another one, Christopher Hibbert, he's an English author with more than 60 titles, so I'll just let that pass. He writes 60 books, you know what kind of person he is. Said that Marion was a wily and elusive character, very active in the persecution of the Cherokee Indians, and not at all the sort of chap who should be celebrated as a hero. And another English critic described Marion as a thoroughly unpleasant dude who was basically a terrorist. Now, since the Mel Gibson's character in the movie is an amalgamation of several Revolutionary War patriots, Morgan, Marion, Sumter, Pickens, why the venom for Marion? Well, it's all Mel Gibson's fault. In the movie, Gibson's character is called the Ghost rather than the Swamp Fox because Gibson didn't want there to be any confusion with the Walt Disney TV character series called The Swamp Fox, starring a very young Leslie Nielsen. I can remember watching The Swamp Fox as a child, and it opened, the opening song was, and I'm not going to sing it, I'll just recite it. Swamp fox, tail on his hat. Nobody knows where the swamp fox at. Swamp fox, hiding in the glen. He runs away to fight again. Whew. I actually used to have a record of that, but it didn't make the move to Still Hopes. So after talking about the amalgamation of patriots, he's hero, and that's Gibson. I mean, it's based on that guy, yeah, and everything down in the South, you know, is the Francis Marion Hotel, the Francis Marion Memorial Park, and the Francis Marion public toilets and everything. Then Gibson, in discussing the bloody nature of the conflict that was true during the French and Indian War, said that Marion dismembered an entire force and sent tongues and fingers in one direction and eyeballs and legs and feet and heads in the other direction and mailed them off to people. That's the kind of barbarism that was around. Baloney. Now remember, Gibson saying this, and he's a fan of Francis Marion, at least he's alleging to be a fan. And he said that the movie would chronicle the struggle for freedom or independence. I mean, you've got people doing extraordinary things and make ultimate sacrifices to maintain what they value or prize of what they profess. And that's the kind of world that's not around anymore, really, I think. Ooh, was he ever prescient on that one? Well, this interview that Gibson had may well be the source of much of the material that was used to assassinate Francis Marion's character. The reputation of a truly great patriot was trashed by Hollywood and the print media. Neither Gibson nor the various critics had their history correct. Francis Marion was a veteran of the French and Indian War. But where did the tales of dismemberment and atrocities come from? Out of thin air. Didn't exist. Actually, during the war, Marion was under the command of Colonel James Grant, a British officer, whose conduct would be repeated by Tarleton and Weems, two British officers during the Revolution. And Marion describes the events that occurred in a letter to a friend. And this, the French and Indian War, this is against the Cherokee, describing actions in upstate South Carolina. The next morning, we proceeded by order of Colonel Grant to burn down the Indian cabins. Some of our men seemed to enjoy this cruel work, laughing very heartily at the curly flames, crackling, and as they mounted, loud crackling over the tops of the huts. But to me it appeared a shocking sight. Poor creatures, thought I, we surely need not grudge them such miserable habitations. But when we came according to orders to cut down the fields of corn, I could scarcely refrain from tears. People remember Marion in his old age, post-Revolutionary War, having a nice plantation in the PD. Well, that was after the war. He married a widow and it was her plantation. He was not much more than a yeoman farmer. And so to cut down somebody's fields was just abhorrent to him, but he did it under orders from a British officer. As for raping his slaves daily, according to one British critic, there's absolutely no evidence of that. In fact, until after the war, he owned very few slaves at all. Now, what about Francis Marion in the field? He's described by his men as being tough but fair, and always enjoyed a reputation as a humane and gentle person. Marion's men seldom took prisoners, and many times went into battle crying, "No quarter for Tories," but that did not include the British, and I need to explain here. When he was in the field against Tory militia, they took no prisoners. Those were South Carolinians who were taking up arms for the king. They showed no mercy in battle. But if they captured a British regular, they took them as a prisoner of war. Cornwallis was upset at Francis Marion's successes and wrote, "Colonel Marion had wrought so on the minds of the people, partly by terror of his threats and cruelty of his punishments, and partly by the promise of plunder, that there was scarcely an inhabitant between the Santee and the PD that was not in arms against us. Some parties had even crossed the Santee and carried terror to the gates of Charleston." The charges are, again, false. Marion was not known to sanction plunder or wanton destruction of property. Thomas Sumter, on the other hand, did both. He had something called Sumter's Law. He basically paid his men with whatever you take. Marion didn't pay his men. McCready, in his wonderful South Carolina in the Revolution, 1780 to 1783, one of the first great histories of modern histories of our state, published at the turn of the last century, in the early 1900s. He lists 20 battles in South Carolina between the fall of Charleston on the 12th of May and its recovery on the 14th of December, 1783, in which Marion led his men against the Army of Occupation. 20 battles in which Francis Marion was the commander. Over the centuries, these names still carry with them the stuff of triumph and daring. Great Savannah, Blue Savannah, Tearcoat Swamp, Fort Mott, Fort Watson, Black Mingo. Let's look at some of them in detail. The Ports Ferry on the 15th of August, 1780. This was the first battle. Then, 5 days later, at Nelson's Ferry, which is important because it comes on the heels of the two American disasters. The first battle of Camden and Sumter's rout at Fishing Creek. Francis Marion had 16 men at Nelson's Ferry. He lost 2. The British were surprised, and what they did was they freed 170 American prisoners of war that had been taken by the British at Camden. The Battle of King's Tree, 27th of August, 1780. With 150 men, he attacked a British army of 800. lost but 30. Battle of Black Mingo, Francis Marion lost a third of his command, but the British lost more. At Fort Watson in April 1781, this was the only time that Francis Marion used traditional military warfare. And at Fort Watson, he and his men built log towers so they could shoot down into the British fort. Defenders were pinned down, and so Marion's men were able to breach the wall. Francis Marion lost 2 men killed, 6 wounded. The British had 120 prisoners of war taken. At Fort Mott, Francis Marion lost no men, and the British had 150 POWs. And of course, that's the famous battle where Rebecca Mott gave Francis Marion arrows, bow and arrow with flame. They used flaming arrows to set fire to the house to drive the British away, out rather. Now, of these engagements, of 14 of the 20 engagements that Marion fought in, came after the Battle of Cowpens, which means just because Lord Cornwallis had taken his army north and left South Carolina did not mean that the struggle was over. It went on even after the Battle of Yorktown. John Buchanan, in his excellent book, The Road to Guilford Courthouse, The American Revolution in the Carolinas, wrote, Marion understood perfectly the function of guerrilla warfare. When Peter O'Ree wanted to build a fort to use as a base to control a section of the countryside, Marion replied, "The open field is our play. That the enemy knew how to defend forts and entrench places than we did much better, and if we attempted them, we'll fall into their hands." He never wrote a manual for partisan warfare, but Mao Zedong did, and nearly 150 years after Francis Marion had become an American legend, he wrote, "In guerrilla warfare, select the tactic of seeming to come from the east and attack from the west. Avoid the solid, attack the hollow, attack, withdraw, attack, withdraw. Deliver a lightning blow, seek a lightning decision." And that is what Francis Marion did. In Jacksonboro, Francis Marion opposed confiscation and retaliation against Tories, another measure of the humaneness of the man. And there's always this famous sweet potato story where he shared his evening meal in the swamp with a British officer offering him a sweet potato. That's all they had. They shared a sweet potato. Francis Marion was the hero of the Revolution, a fact recognized throughout the country. Peter O'Ree's Life of Marion was taken by Parson Weems, and everybody knows Parson Weems' biography, or really hagiography, of George Washington. You know, the cherry tree, and I cannot tell a lie, and I threw the silver dollar across the Potomac, and all of that. Well, he made Washington a hero. He considered Marion equally a hero. He wrote A Life of Marion. And on its title page, he wrote the couplet, "On Vernon's chief why lavish all our lays? Come honest muse and sing great Marion's praise." Vernon's chief, of course, being George Washington. Why we all this praise about George Washington, let's sing about Francis Marion. And William Cullen Bryant, one of the poets of the New England Renaissance, wrote The Song of Marion's Men, which my late father told me as a young boy going to school in Mobile, Alabama, they had to memorize the poem of The Song of Marion's Men. Our band is few, but tried and true, our leader frank and bold. The British soldier trembles when Marion's name is told. Our fortress is the good green wood, our tent the cypress tree. We know the forest round us, as seamen know the sea. We know its walls of thorny vines, its glades of rooty grass, its endless, its safe and silent islands within the dark morass. Marion was a hero not just to South Carolinians, but to all Americans of the new nation, often compared to Washington. Across the United States, there are 27 towns and 17 counties named for Francis Marion. This recognition continued well into the 20th century. In Morrison and Commager's magnificent two-volume history, The Growth of the American Republic, published in 1962, Marion is mentioned twice. One, the first time, as one of the two examples of a popular local leader who led his neighbors in defense of hearth and home, and two, during the discussion of the South Carolina campaign of 1780-81, Marion, Sumter, and Pickens are all mentioned, but only Marion has his nickname. Now, we know that Pickens was the wizard owl and Sumter was the gamecock, but for national historians, the only one worth mentioning was the swamp fox. In a very common encyclopedia that everybody had, the joke in the 19th century, look it up in your Funkin' Wagnalls encyclopedia. Francis Marion is lauded as a great guerrilla leader. Recent efforts to denounce or diminish the role of Francis Marion in our nation's history simply not based in fact. It's either the result of deliberate distortion or misinformation. The fighting, the revolution in South Carolina was bloody. It was a true civil war. William Gilmore Simms once wrote in one of his many Revolutionary War novels that the only true friend a patriot had was his rifle, the only one he could trust. And George Bancroft, who wrote the first great American history in the 19th century, said this about South Carolina and the nature of the conflict. South Carolina moved onward to independence through the bitterest afflictions of civil war. Left mainly to her own resources, it was through the depths of wretchedness that her citizens were to bring her back to her face in the Republic, by their own heroic courage and self-devotion, having suffered more and dared more and achieved more than the men of any other state. And as somebody who spent 30 years of commissioned military service and had a subspecialty in counterinsurgency warfare, I'll say that to a fighting man, you're judged by your enemies. Now, Bannister Tarleton was not exactly a fan of Francis Marion and actually gave him his nickname. After futilely chasing Marion all over the PD, he wrote, "Come, let us go back and we will find the gamecock. But as for this damned fox, the devil himself could not catch him." And so, folks, continue to think of Francis Marion as a hero of the Revolution. And I will say, I actually made this statement before the Sumter County Historical Society with the statue of Thomas Sumter right outside. I was asked, who was the better man? I said, Francis Marion not only was the better man, he was the better military fighter. And I live to tell the tale. I look forward to seeing you next week.